All right, so today I'm going to be talking about CSS and the difference between using pixels, REMs, and EMs. Now, pixels are just pixels on your screen. EMs stands for the M height. Now, that is the default height of the capital letter M in the current font size. So, if you say 16 pixels is my EM value, so 1.0 EMs is equal to 16 pixels, for example. 16 pixels is going to be the height of that capital letter M. Now, what EM does to calculate how big that is, because we're entering the values as 1.0, 1.2, 1.5, 0.6. These are the numbers that we use for EMs. They will look at the size of their parent element to determine, okay, if it's 0.5 EMs, it'll look at the parent and say, okay, half the size of whatever the font size of the parent is. With REMs, it's the root EM value. So whatever value you use for the font size on the HTML element, that's the root of your page. On the HTML element, if you set the font size as 20 pixels and then you use 0.5 REM, you'll get 10 pixels because it's half the 20. Okay, now, what's the difference between REM and EM? That's what I'm going to demonstrate here. So I built a simple page, 3 sections. They each have a different ID. So there's Pixie, Remy, and Emmy. Those are the 3 sections. I'm going to use EMs for all the font sizes in here, REMs in here, and pixels in here. And I'm going to try to sell you on the fact that I believe that REM is the best unit to use. Now, I'm setting a font size on the section, on the div, on the paragraphs, different ones on each of the paragraphs, and then a different one on the span. So let's take a look at those. We'll take a look at the page just quickly here. So here's the pixel section, the REM section, the EM section. Now, with pixels, you have to provide an actual pixel value, so a PX number for every single element that you want to set a size on. So I have one size on here, one on this paragraph, one on the span, a different one on this paragraph. I've got pixel values for the padding, pixel values for the size of this border. For the REM, I'm using REMs for this, the paragraphs, the span, and then in the EMs, I'm using EMs. Let's take a look at the values. So start up at the top here. We'll look at the HTML element. So I am setting as a default for my page 30 pixels. That is my default size on the root element for my page. I've got a line height and a font family. That's just presentation stuff, but the font size, this is important. Now, in the pixel section, I'm setting on the section 36, so it's bigger than this. And then the div gets 30, the first paragraph gets 24, the second paragraph gets 18, and the span gets 15. Easy to read, easy to understand. You can look at those pixel values and, okay, yeah, I get it. But if I want to do something with a media query where I'm changing the font size, and I've got it set on all these elements, that means in my media query, I have to replicate all of this, and I have to change each of the individual values. I have to do calculations myself to figure out what is the new scale that I'm going to use, what are the new sizes that I want to implement. So I'm stuck with rewriting a lot of code for every media query. Now, EMs, pixels originally were considered to be a fixed unit, so they weren't supposed to change as your screen resized or somebody zoomed in or out of the web page. They were supposed to remain the same. Now, Internet Explorer was the only browser that actually implemented that. Everybody else, they let it resize. I mean, by everybody else, I'm talking about Netscape Navigator and Safari. But eventually, everybody started just allowing these to zoom as well. So, although it's an absolute unit, it now resizes too. EMs. Now, here we go with the calculations. With the EM section, I'm saying 1.2 EMs. So it's going to look, who's the parent of this section with the ID EM? I'll scroll down here. The section who's the parent of all of these, so EM, Remy, and Pixie, is the body element. The body element is going to get the same as the HTML element unless we specify otherwise. So this is 30 pixels. Back up to our Emmy. There we go. So 30 pixels times 1.2. That gives us 36. So the section is set at 36 pixels. Now the div that's inside there, I'm saying 1. And because it goes to its parent element, my div now has to go up to the section. So I'm doing 30 pixels times the 1.2 times 1 for this div. That gives me 36. If we go down to the first paragraph and I say 0.8, it's going to be 0.8 times the 1 times the 1.2 times the 30. The second paragraph, shouldn't have that one in there. The second paragraph is going to be 0.6 times its parent times its parent times its parent to calculate, and this is going to be wrong here. This is going to be not this value right here, but we're doing 0.6 times this one. And then the span, 0.5, this is going to be inside this one right here. And again, that's an extra step we don't need inside of there. But we are looking at 0.5 times 0.8 times 1 times 1.2 times the 30. So every time I set a specific font size at any one of the parent elements going down to this element where I'm setting a font size, the browser is calculating all the way down. That means if I suddenly inject a new wrapper element with a different font size, I'm changing everything inside of there. Every layer that you're adding is increasing the complexity of the calculations that you have to make. With root REMs, we're talking about go up to the HTML element. It's a proportion of that. Makes it much easier to standardize through the page. So we've got 1.2 times 30. 1 times 30, 0.8 times 30, 0.6 times 30, 0.5 times 30. It's a simple calculation that you can do. It really is a relative unit, so you can understand, regardless of where these things are nested inside the document structure, we can understand that these things are going to be relative to each other. So this is always going to be 80% and this is 60% of that default number. And it means when I do things like add a media query, all I have to change is this one element, and my whole page, all the content is going to resize. So here we are with the default. So pixels and REMs, as I shrink this down, once I get below 800, there we go. Now this all resized. This didn't change because we've hard-coded the pixels. This one did relative to the root. This one did as well, but we have that problem where the more things that we nest, we end up with some pretty tiny text. And this is just with a few, 3 layers going down to this size. If there was something else inside of there, let's say we had an anchor tag with a span inside of it, and the anchor tag had a font size too, you could end up with text that is massively huge or really, really tiny on the page. So REMs gives you that one target, do everything proportional to that, gives you one thing to change with the media queries, and all your text can resize based on that media query. Now, the other thing I want to take note of is the size of the padding and the borders here. You will see they are different sizes. This is a proportion I'm using. Let's open this up, jump down to that section right there. So you can see I'm using 1.0 REM. So 20 pixels right now because I'm on that media query for both the padding and the border. And if I adjust this, now it's at 30 pixels because that's my root size. So it's just those two sizes that I get, 20 or 30. With the EMs, you'll notice that this is much bigger. Even though I'm at that root element, the one right here, the section, I'm using 1.0 EMs for both of them, but they're bigger than this. And that's because border and padding with EM units are based off of the font size of the unit that they're containing. So it doesn't go to the parent to figure out these. So it's another level of complexity. It's something else that you have to calculate. As I shrink this down, you can see it's never the same here. This changed to point to the parent, so it changed my 1.2 value, but then this is 1 compared to that value. So it's 100% of whatever this font size is. The pixels never changes unless I specifically go into the media query and say, at this point, because I've got pixels here, I have to go into the media query and say, okay, in this media query, I've got to change the border and the padding as well. Everything that I give a pixel value, I have to duplicate that in my media queries. So that's the difference between pixels, REMs, and EMs. EMs calculates differently because it always goes just to the parent, so it's one step up. You can get nesting problems, you can get really complicated calculations for the font sizes. With pixels, you're hard-coded, you're stuck at that value, and if you add media queries, you have to duplicate and change everything. REMs gives you this nice one number that everything is relative to. You change the one number, you change everything for this scale. The REM values can be used for padding, border, margins as well, so that they're always relative to the size of the font. It just makes everything on the page scale very well. And that's it. That is pixels, REMs, and EMs. So I will leave a copy of this as a code gist in the description. If you have questions, feel free to leave those in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching.